Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Natasha's YouTube channel, Read and Write with Natasha. Today, we have another author to interview, and I'm so excited to have him on board. Today, we have Mr. Rayyan Shawaf. Hi, Rayyan, how are you? He's the
Hi,
author of
Natasha.
the book When All Else Fails. Before we get started with him, I'd like to just read the quick bio. Rayyan Al Shawaf is a book critic whose reviews and essays have appeared in the Boston Globe, Christian Science Monitor, Globe and Mail, LA Review of Books, Miami Herald, Minneapolis Star Tribune, San Francisco Chronicle, and others. He lives in Malta, and When All Else Fails is his first novel. So, hi Rayyan, how are you?
Hi, Natasha. I'm fine. Thanks a lot for having me on.
Of course, thank you for joining us. I recently finished your novel, and I really enjoyed it, and I have a lot of questions about it. And the fact that you wrote a novel set between the Middle East and the U.S. and other countries is actually similar to my novel. So I'm really excited to talk about your writing journey. So I think my first question for you is, I'm sure you get this question all the time. I get it all the time. Is this a memoir? And what part of this novel is real, and what part of it is fiction, since it's written from the first person view?
Yeah, I do get the question a lot. Sometimes it's not even a question, it's just a straight up assumption that it must be autobiographical, because um, uh, just for the simple reason that some people are aware of the fact that the protagonist of the novel lived in places I lived in. But the fact of the matter is that that is about the extent of the sort of similarity, because the guy's identity is different from mine, and more importantly, his experiences, his friends, his adversaries, his acquaintances, they're all made up. His all the stuff that I put him through in the novel is made up because I wanted to um, put him through certain paces, have him have certain experiences, that I haven't had. I mean, I had certain things in mind that I was hoping would be funny or instructive or, intriguing or something. And my experiences have been mostly boring and nondescript. So I didn't really draw on my own life insofar as what actually happens is concerned. I simply had him live, for the most part, not entirely, in places I lived in during periods that I lived in. So we're talking here largely about Lebanon and Florida. And that's simply to save myself the trouble of sort of researching what it was like to live elsewhere at a certain time. I mean, I don't know about you, but for my first novel, which is what this was, I was a little bit sort of hesitant about taking the plunge and about certain things like why pile on the challenges when it's already a big enough challenge to write your first novel and to have the protagonist go through the kind of story you've devised. Why sort of add on additional challenges like figure out or research what it was like to live in a certain place at a certain time and then come off sounding artificial instead of drawing on what you know of Orlando and Beirut principally, and just using that as background for the character.
Okay, great. So you mentioned the topic of identity, and that his identity is different than yours. So currently there's like a big movement, maybe you don't necessarily agree with it. It's called, own voices, which is, they want people to write from their own perspective. So I'm just curious, how different is your identity from the main character in your novel? You portrayed him as someone who's Iraqi Christian. Is that similar to your identity? Do you come from the same background?
No, I don't, even though I'm partly of Iraqi origin. Um, But when I say his identity is different from mine, I don't just mean it in the traditional sense, like in the sense of what sociologists call ascribed identity, in the sense that, you know, he's a Chaldean, you know, I'm not. He's Iraqi. I'm only partly of Iraqi origin. I also mean it just in terms of how he sort of identifies himself and what his orientation is, and this and that and the other things um, you pick up with time, and things that you formulate, you know, as you go through life. I mean, I suppose there are some similarities in terms of, for example, I don't know, some of the songs he likes, some of the books he likes, maybe this or that opinion of his. But otherwise, I sought to create a character who is different from me, and I didn't really see any sort of anything controversial or objectionable about that. Um, I think there are instances in which it could be objectionable, especially if it occurs on a wide scale. I mean, if, for example, you are part of a group of people who colonize another people and keep them in subjection, and then decide, or some of you decide, that you want to write, you know, a slew of novels from the perspective of such people, but you never consult them, you never, you know, ask them what their opinion is, and you never give them the chance to write their own novels either. Then, for example, you could have an issue. This has been an issue, for example, in Australia, regarding representation of Aboriginal people, you know, in literature, especially before you had major Aboriginal writers coming to the fore and representing, you know, their own people and such. So there you can have instances of appropriation and this and that and the other. But if it's just a one-off kind of thing, in which where there is no sort of clear kind of um, relationship in which one person is from a ruling class and another person is from a muzzled kind of class, muzzled in the sense that, you know, like, you know, not allowed to, you know, to express him or herself, then I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And in fact, it might be an enriching experience for all of us to try to write from the perspective of other people. I mean, of course, one can end up doing so in a superficial way, and that's worth avoiding. I would not have chosen an Iraqi Chaldean protagonist. I would not have chosen as easily, like, you know, somebody with a completely different identity that I didn't feel I had any sort of familiarity with. You know, something from that of any specific ethnicity or religion that I didn't know anything about. And so I do think that familiarity and knowledge of some kind is essential if you are to come across as you know, as genuine. So I hope that's the case, but I'm probably not the best judge of that. I think, you know, in such instances, you can be an advocate for yourself and what you've done, and you can defend what you've done, and, you know, you can get into debates with people. But ultimately, the judge will be, you know, the reader.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for this. It's well said. I mean, the reason I'm asking because, you know, I read a lot and I don't see many literature by Arab American authors who focus on the Arab Christian identity. And as an Arab Christian myself, I sort of struggle with writing about in my novels. I mean, I kind of mention it, but part of me is like, you know, I like my character is like, I like to make my characters with kind of ambiguous. You don't know if they're Christian or Muslims. I just put them there because part of me, like, I felt this is a Pandora's box and I didn't want to open it. But I
All
realized
right.
that you actually opened it pretty wide, and you know, one of the main struggles, the main character, his name is Hunayun. How do you pronounce his name?
Hunain,
Hunain.
Hunain,
um,
yeah,
Hunain. Okay.
yeah.
So the main reason, you know, Hunain is most of his, like at least 50% of his struggle is about his identity as a Christian Arab, and he struggles with relationship, whether in the West or the East. Like, I felt that he was kind of stuck in purgatory. He does not belong with kind of the Arab camp because he's not Muslim, he belongs to a Christian minority. He does not belong to the kind of Christian West because he's Arab. So I found your portrayal is pretty accurate and very similar to what Arab Christians go through, or at least, I don't want to speak for everyone, but at least to what I went through and I'm still going through as an Arab Christian. So for me, I don't know, I'm assuming that's not your background. And do you feel that because this is not your background, this also allowed you to criticize all religions? Because I felt in your novel you kind of had criticism of Islam, of Christianity, of Judaism, of I think of everything. And do you think because you did not you're not vocal about your identity, this gives you more freedom to do so?
That's a good question. To begin with, let me say that I tried to get some of the nuances right, so that it's not simply about me sort of sounding off and saying what I want to say about Islam or the Christians or whatever. But I tried to get some of the nuances right. Like for example, in the Levant, generally, as I'm sure you know, um, most Christians do consider themselves Arab. This is very much the case among Palestinians, among Syrians, most Syrians, among Jordanians, and to a large extent, to a certain extent, among Lebanese, although traditionally among Maronites, there has been a differing conception of identity. Now, among Iraqi Christians, most, however Arabized, um, do not actually consider themselves Arab in an ethnic sense. And so, for example, even if culturally and linguistically they have been Arabized, they're very particular about the fact that that they descend from a non-Arab, a pre-Arab group. Sometimes they'll put it. This is very much the case among Assyrians, but also among Chaldeans and Syriacs. And so, so Hunayn is not only a minority in the sense of being a Christian from the Arab world, but he's also, like in the technical sense, not Arab. He's not combative about it. He's not anti-Arab. He's not. He knows he has one foot in Arab culture and such. And in fact, because of his sort of uh, moral outlook, he resolves, as you know, not to use his Christian identity or his non-Arab identity as well in the wake of 9/11 to distance himself from the sort of despised of our era. Even though he could do that, he could well say that, listen, I have nothing to do with these Muslim people, and so if you want to consider them all terrorists or whatever, I mean, that's fine, but it's got nothing to do with me. But it's something he resolves not to do. Now, in my personal sense, in terms of what I wanted to say, yes, I did to a certain extent use his identity to talk about certain things. Like here's an example. I wanted to draw attention to the plight of Christians in Iraq, given in the wake of the U.S.-led invasion and the rise of Islamist parties, fanatic Islamist parties. And I felt that it would be easier to do this if the protagonist were Iraqi to begin with, and better yet, from one of the Iraqi Christian communities. In this case, Chaldean, because if otherwise, it might feel like I'm sort of shoehorning the topic into the story. But I felt if he is Iraqi to begin with, and if he's Christian, and from the ethnic minority group that consists of Chaldeans, Assyrians, and Syriacs, he himself is Chaldean, then this would be something he would be preoccupied with. And so I could then talk about this subject and the plight of Iraqi Christians without it appearing to, without the reader thinking that why is this guy, this writer, taking off on a tangent about something that isn't really germane or doesn't relate directly to the story. It relates very much directly to the story and to the protagonist and to his heartbreak at what has befallen his country, and also his shock and surprise, because he was under the impression that the removal of Saddam would sort of usher in a new era and all this. So I did, to a certain extent, use him in a somewhat in this manner to be able to talk about things in a natural way, Whereas if his identity had been completely different, it might have come across as the writer being sort of didactic and sort of lecturing the reader about, you know, what's happening in Iraq or something, which diverges from, you know, the storyline. So I think that was always in the back of my mind, that I wanted to draw attention to the fact that that in our part of the world, it's not everybody is Muslim, and there are Christian Arabs and there are also non-Christian Arabs. And that's one thing I want to do, and talk about like how this is not quite understood in the West in general, I suppose, at the risk of generalizing, and the United States, and how it can lead to comic sort of encounters, how it can lead to misunderstandings, how it can lead to objectification, all kinds of things. And obviously, by virtue of the protagonist being a Chaldean, that gave me the springboard to be able to do that. But also, it gave me, like I said, the launching pad to have him talk at length, or muse at length, about what's happening to his kith and kin in Iraq as a result of the rise of Islamist supremacist political parties.
So, what was the inspiration for this novel? Um,
If I were to boil it down to one idea, I would say that, and I'm sorry if this sounds like a little bit dry or sterile, because it's not an experience, as it were. You know, some people have an experience, you know, and it's I don't know, very traumatic or something, and then it inspires them to write a novel, and maybe the novel is cathartic for them. For me, it was more like a sort of an intellectual kind of notion, and which is simply that even though for all of us who are aware that guilt by association is logically untenable, uh, we would have to conclude that the flip side of that, virtue by association, is equally untenable, is equally illogical, doesn't make any sense. And yet, ironically, sometimes it is only by playing on the notion of virtue by association that we can get certain tormentors off our backs. It's sad, but sometimes if you're being bullied or tormented or persecuted or something of that nature, if you try to reason with the people who are, you know, pushing you around and such, and try to tell them that, you know, listen, you're not responsible for what these people from your group have done, if they're criminals or if they're terrorists, and that you shouldn't be associated with them just because you're members of the same general religious or ethnic group. This kind of thing doesn't go very far. What does go far is if you are able to point to somebody from your general ethnic or religious group whom they admire, and then that will give them pause, and they will automatically think, oh, well, you know, maybe you're okay after all. Again, logically speaking, it doesn't make sense. But if it's the only way out, sometimes we have to resort to that, despite our distaste for it, because we know that virtue by association is really just the other side of the coin. It's like guilt by association, but it's the only way sometimes to to be able to, like I said, get our tormentors off our backs. You know what I mean?
so, for you, it was a bit cathartic. You know, you wanted to send a message through this book. Is that what I understood?
Well, it wasn't cathartic in the sense that I was trying to get through any kind of personal kind of experience, or play it out or anything like that. So I wouldn't say so, but I would say that it just allowed me to explore an irony, and I'm big on exploring ironies. Um,
Okay.
Hunain fancies himself a rigid logician. Right? He thinks he's very logical, and so just as, like I said, he's not keen on guilt by association. He thinks virtue by association is equally bad, and like I said, he does not play up his Christian affiliation in order to, for example, get himself off the hook if people are, hounding Arabs or Muslims. But there comes a time when, and it happens to him when he's young, when the only way that that he can sort of dissuade or even deter people from beating up on him is by resorting to that distasteful kind of play, which is uh, uh, seizing on virtue by association
Mm-hmm.
in order to do that. And this is I mean, this comes through later in the novel without giving it away when he is a teacher at a school, and he comes into contact with a student who's being bullied, and the student who's being bullied um, finds that perhaps the only way um, to give his bullies pause is to play on this virtue by association. And Hunain finds this distasteful, and he's about to lecture the student about how silly and superficial his defense, as it were, is. But then Hunain remembers a similar incident that occurred when he was about this child's age, back when he was, 12 or 13 in middle school, and
Mm-hmm.
and how he used the same sort of tack in order to give his tormentors pause and to get them to think more highly of him. He resorted to um, this kind of like um, virtue by association of look at somebody whom you admire, and by the way, that person, like me, is Iraqi. And his tormentors would never have guessed that, but then, it gave them pause. It's sort of like, imagine if you're, I don't know, if you're a kid in middle school or high school and you're gay and you're being bullied for it. It shouldn't really make much difference whether you can point to a famous football player or a boxer who's also gay, or a pop star or something, and say, well, that person's gay just like me, so lay off. But
Mm-hmm.
actually, it can be quite effective, because if you know that your tormentors who are bullying you for being gay have this, I don't know, notion of toxic masculinity, and think that, because you're gay, you're not sufficiently masculine. If you know that they are big supporters of some football player or some boxer or somebody who's associated with traditional notions of masculinity, and that person's gay, then you can say, like, hold on a second, guys. Isn't your big, hero there? Isn't that your big idol or whatever? Did you know that he's gay, is like me? And then, that would give them pause. It'd be like, whoa, and maybe that would cause them to reconsider their, their hostile attitudes toward their peer whom they're bullying, because just because he's gay. It's sometimes, like I said, this is the only sort of way out. This is the only sort of way to escape in certain circumstances, being harassed or belittled or tormented or bullied.
Yeah, I mean that's very well said. So based on that, did you get any criticism? As an author, we have to live with feedback, whether it's positive or negative. So I was curious if you got criticism, because of what you wrote about religion, and also about how you portrayed the Daily Star in Lebanon, which is an
Mhm.
actual newspaper. So let's start first with the religion part, or what kind of feedback you got.
Yeah, actually, surprisingly, I didn't get any negative feedback regarding that issue. Now, I'm not so naive as to think that that's because everybody liked, Hunain's um, flippant sort of attitude toward religion. Hunain can be quite irreverent or even flippant, like I said, when it comes to sacred cows. It's particularly sort of Islamic ones. Which is to say that, even though he has Muslim friends, and he's comfortable being from a Muslim majority region and all that, it's not to say that he sort of uncritically accepts anything and everything that's put out there in terms of presenting Islam as synonymous with peace and, all this sort of thing. He knows the situation is a little bit more complicated than that. But he's also actually, despite being a Christian himself, um, dismissive of certain sacred cows insofar as, say, if you are a biblical literalist, for example, would be concerned. I mean, he's big on Christ, but he's big on Jesus's moral teachings more than anything else, more than, say, questions of divinity and this and that and the other. And this comes up, on occasion. And again, he's not a literalist either, like when it comes to, Noah's Ark and stuff. So there are a few jokes that make that clear, and that was intentional, because I wanted him to have this sort of identity. And so no, that hasn't come up, at least in a personal sense. But like I said, I'm sure that some people would be offended, and but I instead received criticism over things that might have been misunderstood in a few instances. Like, for example, something like sexually explicit scenes and such, and the sort of objectification of women that occurs in those scenes. And I would have to sort of hasten to explain in such instances that, listen, I think if you take a step back and look at it, you'll notice that A, the sexually explicit stuff is not gratuitous, and B, it's not meant to titillate. Just not to say there's anything wrong with that. If you want to write erotica or something, that's fine. But that's not the purpose here. And C, perhaps most importantly, what essentially happens on so many occasions in this novel is that, to give one example, there's a character called Kendra, whom Hunayn objectifies, to be sure, in the physical sense. Like, he can tell, for example, that they don't really click on any kind of level other than physically. He's physically drawn to her, and he is virginal and lovelorn and all the rest of it, right? But he's so busy objectifying her physically, so much so that, like I said, he sets aside his sort of hesitation about getting involved with her, because he knows he can tell that they're not really compatible, otherwise. But he is so drawn to her physically and objectifies her to such a degree physically, that he misses a certain indicators, certain hints, that the whole time that he's objectifying her physically, she is exoticizing, if not fetishizing him, because she thinks he's Muslim. And that's, from her perspective, something is sexy and exotic and different. So this completely escapes him until the critical moment during a sex act, when it's revealed, and it's played for laughs so that hopefully the reader finds it funny, but also the deeper subtext is that we sometimes objectify and exoticize and fetishize each other. And this is something that courses through the book. This is something that you come across in different instances through the book. It's the way our sexual attraction to each other as human beings is impinged upon by our notions and sometimes misperceptions of what the other person is. Regarding your question concerning the Daily Star,
Yeah.
The sort of unfortunate footnote is that whatever kind of feedback anybody would have given me, now it's in one sense it's too late, because the Daily Star is folded. So the Daily Star is no more. I don't know if you've heard this, but yeah, due to financial difficulties and all that, so it has ceased to exist as a newspaper. But maybe if there were anybody who would take offense, I mean, maybe they wouldn't be as offended now because the newspaper doesn't exist anymore. I'm not sure. I know that some people who worked there in the past would get a kick out of it. I think if they were to read it. And I did tell a few people, but I didn't hear back from them as to whether they ended up reading it or not. I know one person was planning to, and this and that and the other. But yeah, I did use the real name of a newspaper. I used the real name of a couple of locales, like in Beirut, for example, Captain's Cabin, an old bar that's been around since '64. But I changed names, whether it was the Daily Star or the proprietor of the cabin, or anybody else. In those rare instances in which I sort of modeled the character on a real person, I changed the name. Yeah.
Yeah, that's too bad to hear about the Daily Star, because the in the book he meets with the editor, and the editor tells him that he wants it to be like one of its kind in the region. And I remember when they had that enthusiasm, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
really, as a journalist myself, I'm sad to hear that. So okay, I wanted to know a bit about your writing habits. What's your daily routine? And how did you write this? Because writers have different writing habits. Some like tend to write every day, like rain or shine, like myself, and others just, write sporadically. And so, where do you stand when it comes to this?
Well, I admire your discipline, and I think your way to do it is the right way. And I would like to do that myself. I have a few sort of hangups, just psychological hangups about, sitting down and writing and picking up, where I left off and this and that and the other. They're mostly just um, excuses, and they're self-defeating. And what they end up meaning is that I put things off. And then if I do write something that I'm pleased with, um, it's a good thing in one sense, but it's almost like it's a bad thing in another sense, because I have difficulty picking up where I left off and feeling that I can keep things at the same level. I think that if I manage to pull off a good writing session and the quality of the material is good, that the next time around, it will inevitably dip in quality. And of course, like I said, it's self-defeating, and it ends up meaning that I put off, resuming the writing. And so that's why it's taking me so long to complete the novel I'm working on now. Also, the pandemic affected things. I mean, I don't want to blame it all on the pandemic, but the pandemic sort of affected things. But I do think that the best way to write is not to sit around waiting for inspiration or even try to cultivate inspiration, but to actually sit down and get cracking, and to get in the habit of writing, like you said, say every day or every other day, rain or shine. Um, yeah, with the first one, I was more disciplined than I have been with this second one. With the first one, I didn't write every day, admittedly, but and had I written every day, I probably would have completed it um, um, faster than I did. It took me 22 months to write When All Else Fails, but like I said, um, I didn't work on it every day. With this one, there have been long stretch. I've been working on this one in fits and starts. Really, I mean, there've been long stretches during which I haven't worked on it, but I'm trying to rectify that and to be sort of disciplined about it. But my writing habits aren't very good. I guess that's the short answer to the question, especially when it comes to writing fiction. I mean, when it comes to reviewing books and the like, I think much more disciplined.
Hmm. What are you working on these days?
Well, I'm working on a novel that's completely different from the first one, and without giving too much away, it has to do with the Nakba, and with a young Palestinian man who is made a refugee by the Nakba, and who ends up devising what he considers to be an ingenious way to make his way back to Palestine, which has since become Israel, and to which he is barred entry simply because he's Palestinian. And this plan of his entails going to Iraq and then making his way to Israel. And so the novel takes place in between um, Palestine and then a refugee camp, which is where he winds up for a time, and then Iraq, all as part of this plan, which kind of looks good on paper, but obviously complications ensue. Um, which if it bears fruit, this plan would see him return to his homeland, which is of course which was the preoccupation of all Palestinian refugees, and even to this day, many of their descendants are continue to insist on their right of return and such. And so that's what that one is about. So completely different time and place, and well, and protagonist and all this from the first one. and more ambitious in scope, I think, as well, which is good. I mean, we should all sort of, challenge ourselves, I think, as we go along,
Mhm, mhm. It's great. Can't wait to read it. So now I just want to talk about the way you approached publishing. So when you published your first novel, did you go with an agent or you went directly to the publisher? How was the publishing journey for you?
Well, trying to land an agent was very frustrating, and
Mm,
so I eventually gave up on the process. I approached agents, and sometimes they asked for material, or maybe their guidelines said send something to begin with, and so I did. But the ironic thing that happened more than once is that I would I would conduct research regarding agents and what their area of specialty was and all this. And then I would think that this one or that one would make a good match. And I would send the manuscript along with the first chapter or whatever, the guidelines state you should do. And then I would hear back from somebody like, an assistant or an intern or
mhm,
somebody like that. And I felt that maybe the material wasn't being given its due and wasn't even being read by the person to whom I had addressed it or in whose hands I wanted to place it. And so I got a bunch of rejections, and I started to get, like I said, frustrated by the process. And I think I just started thinking maybe I can cut out the middleman and then just go straight to the publishers. Of course, the risk you run when doing that is that um, most publishers and all of the big ones don't accept unagented submissions.
mm,
So in cutting out the middleman, is it where you're also crossing off a bunch of publishers off your list, realistically speaking. Um, but that was fine because I didn't necessarily want to make land a deal with a major publisher the first time around and make a big splash. I mean, if I could, so much the better, but it wasn't an expectation. And so then I started to approach the smaller publishers, like independent publishers and what have you, and and, and including Interlink. And Interlink is interesting for a number of reasons. But one of them is that the guy who heads up Interlink, Michel Mshebik, is a Palestinian who was born and raised in Lebanon.
mm,
And he set up Interlink in the 80s uh, with his then wife to try to introduce Arab and African voices to an American readership. And so they're actually very big on publishing stuff from the Arab world or with Arab themes and this and that. Although most of the time, almost all the time, when it comes to stuff from the Arab world um, or sub-Saharan Africa, the fiction titles are translated into English. So I was unsure as to whether they would accept my manuscript because it was written in English. It's not, it wasn't written in another language. And like I said, although their nonfiction titles tend to be written in English, their fiction titles tend to be translations from Arabic, among other languages. But I guess they were, sufficiently taken with the manuscript, thankfully, that they accepted it, and then eventually published it. So after it took some doing, to find the right publisher, but eventually it worked out.
mm. That's great. So what about your next novel? Are you gonna go with the same publisher?
I might want to try shopping this one around. I mean, it's premature. I just haven't really thought about what I'll try to do when it's done. But I'm not under contract or anything with Interlink or with anybody else, so I can, in theory, sort of try to interest anyone in acquiring it. And I may well do that and see if anybody is interested. And then if not. Maybe approach Interlink and see if they'd like to take a look at something that's completely different from the first one. And I would emphasize that so that they know that I'm not sort of treading familiar territory and reworking the same story or anything like that. Um, yeah.
And have you ever thought of self-publishing? I mean, why don't you just cut all the gatekeepers entirely? I mean, that's kind of the route that I'm thinking about with my second novel, is why not take a stab at that? I mean, for you financially it would be better, one, and two, you can do your own marketing, which is everyone now they're doing their own marketing regardless if they have a publisher or not. So why do you think you need the publisher in the first place?
Well, I actually don't think that in my case it would be a good idea to self-publish because I don't think very many people would read it. I think if you have a major social media presence or a following of some kind because of some previous work you did or something, then you basically have a guaranteed readership. I didn't have a Facebook account or a Twitter account before this novel. In fact, I established them in large part partly at the urging of my publisher to promote the novel, because when you get on with an indie publisher, they don't have like a budget the way the big major publishers do to do all this public promotion for you. You have to do some of the legwork yourself. So that was the idea. But even now, for example, I don't have a large sort of following on either. So I think that the danger is that if you don't have a large following and such, that the book would fall into a sort of black hole. But certainly that doesn't apply to others. I'm still sort of still have a bit of a traditional mindset, like I want
Mm.
to get on with a publisher and secure an advance if possible as well, and know that they're going to print a certain number of copies, and then if earn out, then I'll get royalties, and then they'll do a digital version, and this, that, and the other. But I realize the publishing landscape is changing, and
Mhm.
for certain people, there is no need necessarily to get a traditional publisher.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it has changed dramatically, so maybe something just to think about in the future. And I'll tell you what happens with me, and
Yeah.
we'll take it from there. So, who are the authors that inspired you? I mean, like, maybe it's a cliche questions, but like favorite authors, favorite book, people that you sort of steal from. I mean, I say steal in a good way, because everybody steals. You steal like an artist, like Austin Kleon said in his book. So, who do you steal from?
Yeah, well, I think it's it's one of those things where like it's different from one project to the next. So, for example, I can in what I'm working on now is different from the first one. From the first one, I felt that I was inspired um, even like, for example, sometimes maybe drew upon in a certain way authors such as Hanif Qureshi, who was a British writer of Pakistani origin, or partly of Pakistani origin, who's written The Buddha of Suburbia and The Black Album. Um, a guy called Edward Limonov, who had has had a very checkered political career, but wrote a novel called It's Me, Eddie, as a Russian exile living in the United States during the waning days of the Soviet Union. Um, a, uh, a Palestinian author who's a citizen of Israel, and who has written about the difficulties of Palestinians in Israel within the Green Line, Sayyid Qashua, who's come to be rather well known.
Sorry.
Um,
Yeah.
and so those are some of them. That there, a couple of others um, with regard to the first one. But they're not necessarily on my mind if I'm working on a short story or the second novel or something of that kind. And so I think I don't know if there's one sort of constant, like that's always hovering in the back of my mind when I'm embarking on a literary project. I think it kind of depends whether it depends on the project, on the undertaking, the nature of the story, and the content, and that kind of thing.
Hmm.
I just remembered regarding the first one that was probably a bit of an indirect influence. I think all of the ones I mentioned are indirect influences, but also Gary Steingart and sort of some of his humor.
And I'm curious, for a book reviewer, how many books do you read a year? You must read a lot of
Well,
books.
yeah, I mean, and I used to even more so than now. Now I have a day job editing papers for a think tank, and so that takes up most of my time. I work remotely. I continue to review, albeit in a diminished capacity. Um, in the old days, I was a full-time book critic, and I had relationships with several publications, and so I would contribute to several simultaneously. Um, uh, these days, I continue to review the books. I mean, recently I had a few reviews come out because after a spell during which I hadn't reviewed anything, I contacted a few of my editors and said, "Listen, how about this or that? Or would you be willing to assign me something?" Um, and a few said yes. So I reviewed a novel called New York, My Village by Uwem Akpan for the Washington Post. I reviewed a nonfiction book by Omar Muallim about Islam in the Americas, North and South America. Um, and I reviewed the latest novel by Percival Everett. The Omar Muallim one was for NBR, the National Book Review, and the Percival Everett one was for the Minneapolis Star Tribune. So I do continue to review it. It keeps the mind limber, and I don't want to sort of sever my contacts with publications, especially those publications that I have like a long-standing relationship with. But I don't do nearly as much as I did before.
I get asked a lot by especially young authors about how to publish a novel. Like, how do you do it? So, if you can give us like maybe three steps of how you should do it, and especially if someone has an idea and passionate about writing, but they have not published anything before, what would you tell them? One, two, three, four.
Well, I would say that if you want to do things the traditional way, then as we discussed earlier, try to get an agent. But don't just sort of carpet bomb all the literary agencies out there. Maybe try to do some research and see which agents specialize in what, because sometimes they have certain well, they have a backlog, and they have successfully placed this or that manuscript with this or that editor, and sometimes they'll tell you what they like, and they usually tell you what they like and specialize what they're looking for, etc. And one thing you can do to kind of tailor your introductory sort of message or letter to this or that agency or agent in particular, is to not only sort of personalize the message, but also do your homework and see if the agent in question has represented writers in the past and specific works as well that might bear certain similarities to what you're working on or what you've just completed. And sometimes you can find such information, like, for example, just go to your bookshelf and pull off the shelves books that you like and that you think have inspired your work, and then check out the acknowledgments page, and you'll find oftentimes that the writer will thank his or her agent. And so then if you were to approach the agent in question, you could say, listen, that the novel by such and such a person, which you represented, is one of my favorites, or for example, one that I emulated to a certain extent when working on this one. And so I figure, it might be right up your alley, as a result. So I wonder if you would look at some of my material and decide if you'd like to take on my manuscript. It bears, a certain resemblance to, others that you've worked on, others that you've successfully placed with publishers, et cetera. That's one way to do things. Another thing to do is, if you are approaching publishers directly, is to pay close attention to when it comes to who accepts unagented submissions and who accepts agented ones. The ones that don't accept agented submissions, you might be able to sort of get your foot in the door, even though technically you don't have an agent, simply if you write a uh, a, a, a message that shows that you are intimately familiar with the publishing house in question, and this would have to be like a smaller publishing house, not the big one, and their sort of repertoire, and say that you think that your novel would make for a good fit for such and such a reason. And if they do accept agented submissions, sorry, if they do accept unagented submissions, so in other words, you don't need an agent to write them, then you don't have to sort of I don't know, flatter them, that much in order to get them to look at your stuff, because in principle they're willing to look at it anyway. But pay close attention to these sort of windows that they give you, because it might not be year round that they accept manuscripts from prospective writers. So it does kind of depend, like I said, on whether you're trying to land an agent, or if you're going directly to the publishing houses. And if you're going directly to the publishing houses, whether you want to try your luck with the ones uh, that don't accept unagented submissions, and you try to sort of maybe kind of butter them up a little bit, flatter them in order to get them to look at your manuscript. But if you are approaching publishing houses that do accept unagented submissions, so much the better. Just pay attention to the sort of the time window. They might only accept these submissions seasonally, if you don't have an agent, and pay close attention to what they tell you about whether you should submit the first chapter or the first three or an extract of some kind, and that sort of thing. And make sure also that you in describing your novel, you write a synopsis that's kind of punchy, that it's not merely descriptive, and it's not too long. So it's punchy, but it's also maybe one with, like, if not a cliffhanger sort of ending, then at least it sort of poses questions, like, like what's going to happen. You set things up so that the love affair, or the action sequence, or whatever it is, and then you don't take the next step, but you kind of interest the person whom you're writing in what the next development might be, and you tell them that I have a more extensive kind of synopsis. If you'd like to look at it, this is the short, punchy one. If you want the more extensive one with all the spoilers and all that, I've got one of those as well. So that way you have several things going, and you have several options available to you in trying to elicit the interest of an agent or a publisher.
Mhm. That's great. Thank you very much, Rayyan, for your time. I learned a lot from you. It was a great conversation, and thank you for joining the show. And I wish you the best of luck with your next novel, and let's stay in touch. And do you have any last comments or thoughts?
Well, I just want to thank you, Natasha, for having me on. It's been great, and I appreciated your questions as well. It was interesting, kind of revisiting some of the things I had to grapple with when writing the novel. And as I told you before we started, I'll be reading yours. I look forward to it. They call me Wyatt, and I'm glad that you got a kick out of mine, and I look forward to reading yours. And thanks again for having me. It's much appreciated.
Thank you. Appreciate it.